The atmosphere of the party grew more vibrant as the night stretched on. Music thumped in the air, blending with laughter and conversation. Penn and Gareth stood slightly apart, observing the crowd with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. Around them, people were dancing, their bodies moving with the rhythm of the music. The sense of celebration was palpable, each individual caught up in the flow of the night, lost in the joy of the moment. Slowly, members of the crew began to gather around Penn and Gareth. Deeg was busy with his usual experiments, except this time, it wasn't scientific anomalies that had his attention, it was the buffet table. A mountain of different dishes lay before him, and he was determined to taste them all. First, he sampled each dish individually, savoring the unique flavors of human cuisine. Then, in typical Deeg fashion, he started creating odd combinations, mixing savory with sweet, spicy with mild. His small, nimble fingers selected ingredients with the precision of a seasoned chef, even though his end goal was pure experimentation. Next to him, Tunny T was immersed in their own form of research, meticulously analyzing every bite Deeg took with a portable analysis machine. Tunny T's focus was absolute, their hands working swiftly to record data, utterly indifferent to the chaotic noise of the party that swirled around them. It was as if the outside world had ceased to exist, except for the machine and its endless readouts. Twill, having gathered the courage to leave his usual corner of solitude, approached the table with a small piece of bread. His slow, careful steps spoke volumes about the effort it took for him to be here, amidst the loud music and chaotic energy. He climbed up beside Gareth, the subtle tremble in his movements betraying his nerves. "How are you doing, Twill?" Gareth asked, lowering his voice so it wouldn't startle the already shaky crew member. I'm doing," Twill managed, his voice thin and unsure. His hands trembled slightly as he held the piece of bread, nibbling on it more out of a need for distraction than hunger. Gareth observed him silently for a moment. It was clear that just showing up had been a battle for Twill, but he was here. He'd made it this far, and that was something to be proud of. Penn leaned forward from where she stood, offering Twill an encouraging smile. "You're doing great, Twill," she said warmly. Though he didn't reply, Twill's ears twitched and his fur puffed up ever so slightly. He didn't speak, but there was a noticeable difference in his posture, just a little more pride, a little less fear. He took another small bite of his bread, the simple action laced with a bit more confidence. Meanwhile, Deeg, having sampled a particularly spicy dish, wiped his mouth dramatically and hopped down from the bench. He dusted himself off with a flourish, as if preparing for a grand performance. "All right, enough of this," he declared, his voice full of determination. "Time to try some Terran dancing. A bit energetic, but I think I can keep up." Gareth raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good luck with that," he said dryly, knowing full well what was in store. Deeg waved off the skepticism with a confident grin. "You give me too little credit," he called back over his shoulder as he made his way toward the group of dancers. The humans were moving in pairs, switching partners at intervals, their movements light and carefree. Deeg watched carefully, his eyes scanning for an opening. After a few moments, he hopped into the rhythm with a surprising amount of grace, moving in time with the music. Though he was significantly shorter than the humans around him, Deeg adapted quickly. Where his height became an issue, he improvised, making up for it with sharp, precise steps. The other dancers barely noticed the difference. They weren't here to judge technique, only to enjoy the moment. The music flowed through the room like a living thing, pulsing with energy. As Deeg danced, he felt the rush of movement around him, the quick exchanges of partners, the laughter, the sweat clinging to the skin of those who danced without a care in the world. It was an entirely new experience for him. The people here didn't dance for the sake of perfection. They danced because it felt good, because it brought them joy. The exertion only added to their happiness, as if the act of pushing their bodies beyond comfort made the moment all the more exhilarating. A woman with curly brunette hair caught his eye as she twirled into his arms. She wore a simple crocheted dress that flared out with her every spin, and handmade bracelets clinked together as she moved. Her skin glistened with sweat, but it wasn't exhaustion that showed in her face, only pure, unfiltered joy. Her deep green eyes sparkled, and though her mouth barely curved into a smile, her expression radiated happiness. She was completely immersed in the moment, lost in the rhythm of the music, and Deeg couldn't help but be mesmerized. They danced together for a while, and Deeg quickly realized something. This woman hadn't stopped dancing since the festivities began. She moved with such fluidity, such stamina, that it was as if the music itself powered her every step. No breaks, no signs of fatigue, just an endless flow of energy. Deeg, on the other hand, felt his energy draining. It wasn't that he couldn't keep up with the speed or the dexterity of the movements. Those were easy enough. But these humans didn't stop. They just kept going and going, their bodies fueled by some internal drive that seemed to defy the limitations of physical endurance. Eventually, Deeg had to bow out. He timed his exit with as much grace as he could muster, spinning out of the dance and making his way back to the table. His chest heaved with every breath as he climbed onto the bench, collapsing dramatically with a heavy sigh. "Wow," he panted, unable to find any other words. Penn chuckled from across the table. "You dance well, Deeg. Looked like you were having fun out there." "Fun?" Deeg scoffed, still catching his breath. "I nearly collapsed." "What's the saying? Dance till I dropped?" "Yeah, that's it. I danced till I damn near dropped." Gareth laughed. "You were out there for, what, 9 minutes?" Deeg's eyes widened in disbelief. 9 minutes? No way. It felt like hours. 9 minutes and 17 seconds. Tunny T chimed in without missing a beat, still engrossed in their analysis. Deeg groaned, throwing his head back dramatically. "It's this planet's atmosphere. Way too thick, and the gravity. Don't get me started on the gravity. Even with the suit's assistance, it's exhausting." Penn shook her head, amusement dancing in her eyes. Sure. Blame the atmosphere, Deke. Gareth, ever the instigator, jabbed at Penn with a playful grin. Why don't you show us how it's done, then? I think I'll pass, Penn said quickly, her eyes narrowing at the suggestion. Before she could dismiss the idea entirely, another voice cut in from behind her. I'd be happy to take that dance. The entire group turned to see a man standing just behind Penn. He was slim, with tan skin and loose, flowing clothes that seemed made for dancing. He was younger than Penn by a few years and shorter by more than a few inches, but there was a confident, almost disarming smile on his face. His short hair was neatly combed, and his demeanor radiated charm. If you'll have me, he said, extending a hand toward Penn with an exaggerated flourish. Penn blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Gareth, sensing her discomfort, stepped in. I think she's... But the man was undeterred. Nonsense. I'm quite skilled, you'll see. His hand remained extended, his smile never wavering. Penn raised an eyebrow. Bold. That was for sure. I don't think I... Before she could finish, Deeb nudged her with a mischievous grin. Go on, Penn. Have some fun for once. She glared at Deeb for a moment, but his words lingered. It had been a long time since she'd let herself relax, and she knew it. Fine, she sighed, taking the man's hand. If nothing else, she figured a little dancing couldn't hurt. Gareth watched in disbelief as Penn stood, towering over the man even more noticeably now that they were both upright. There were plenty of humans here who matched Penn in height, but this man was not one of them. Still, he moved with the confidence of someone who didn't care about such trivial details. The man led Penn into the group of dancers, and to her surprise, he was good, really good. Despite their height difference, he moved with fluidity, guiding her through the steps with an ease that made it clear he wasn't lying about his skill. Relax, he said softly as they began to move. We're not enemies here. You don't need to analyze me for weaknesses. Just listen to the music, let go, and I'll follow. Penn stiffened, immediately aware of how out of place she felt. I've never been great at this, she muttered. I'm not exactly built for. It's not how you're built, the man interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. It's how tense you are. Let it go. You're in your own head too much. Just listen to the rhythm. She hesitated for a moment, but then exhaled, letting her shoulders drop slightly. He was right, of course. She was thinking too much, focusing on what could go wrong, on how out of place she felt. Combat training had conditioned her to assess every situation for threats, weaknesses, angles of attack. But this wasn't a battlefield. Slowly, she started to focus on something familiar, her footwork. In her mind, she shifted from thinking of this as dancing to something more structured, like close combat footwork drills. With that in mind, she began to relax more, letting her body move in time with the music. See? Not so bad, the man said with an encouraging smile. You've got it." Pen allowed herself a small smile in return. Bit by bit, the tension in her body unwound, and she began to enjoy herself. The music, the laughter, the feel of the ground beneath her feet, it all started to blend together, creating a sense of peace she hadn't realized she needed. As they continued to dance, Pen's eyes drifted around the crowd. She saw familiar faces, crew members she trusted, and strangers whose only care in the world was the next step in the dance. The smell of the outdoors, wood smoke from the bonfire, the crisp night air, and the scent of cooked meats filled her senses. It was peaceful. Back at the table, Gareth watched Pen with a smirk. "She's actually doing it," he muttered, half in disbelief. Tunny T didn't look up from their analysis, but offered a quiet comment. "It seems to be working." But as Gareth continued to watch Pen, his smile faded. His eyes narrowed slightly as they focused on the man dancing with her. Something about him didn't sit right with Gareth. It wasn't the way he danced. He was skilled, no doubt about that. It wasn't even the way he talked, though his overly confident tone grated on Gareth's nerves. No, it was something deeper. A gut feeling, something Gareth couldn't quite put into words. He didn't trust this man. "I know that look," Tunny T said quietly. "Disdain." "It's not that," Gareth replied, though his eyes never left the man. "I just don't like him." Tunny T glanced up, their gaze flicking from Gareth to the man in question. "Seems fine to me." "How could you possibly tell?" "You haven't even looked up from your work," Gareth muttered under his breath. The night continued, with more dancing, laughter, and food. Bit by bit, the crowd thinned as people began to head home, their energy finally waning after hours of celebration. The crew, now resting at the table, exchanged stories of the night, watching as the festival slowly wound down. It wasn't until much later that Gareth noticed Pen was missing. His frills flared with sudden concern, and he quickly stood, scanning the area for any sign of her. But she was nowhere to be found. He spotted Deeg, who was deep in conversation with a few locals, and hurried over. "Deeg, have you seen Pen?" Deeg looked up, confused. "Not recently." "Maybe she's... Oh, wait, there's that dancer guy. He might know." Gareth's gaze snapped to where Deeg was pointing, and his eyes narrowed. The man was still lounging casually, sipping from a drink. Without hesitation, Gareth marched over, his jaw set. "Hey," he called, his voice sharp. "Where's Pen?" The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unbothered by Gareth's tone. "Whoa, easy there. If I'm misunderstanding your tone." "No, you've got it right," Gareth snapped. "Where is she?" The man held up his hands in a placating gesture. "We danced for a while. She had fun, and then she left. Headed back to your ship, I think. She looked like she needed some rest." Gareth's frills flared in irritation, but he said nothing more. Without another word, he turned and made his way back to the ship. His heart pounded in his chest as he hurried down the corridors, his mind racing with worry. When he reached Penn's quarters, the door panel indicated that someone was inside. He knocked, waiting for a response, but there was only silence. After a moment of hesitation, he keyed in the override code and opened the door slightly. Inside, Penn was curled up in bed, fast asleep. The soft glow of the cabin lights illuminated the room, casting gentle shadows across her peaceful face. Gareth let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his shoulders relaxing. As he turned to leave, something on the floor caught his eye. A sketchbook, half open, lay next to the bed. Curious, Gareth knelt down and carefully flipped it open. His breath caught in his throat. The pages were filled with detailed drawings of Deeg, of the festival, of the people they had met. Each drawing was incredibly lifelike, as if captured in a moment of perfect stillness. But what really stood out was the one of Deeg. It was almost photographic in its accuracy, every detail captured with such precision that it seemed to leap off the page. Gareth smiled softly to himself. Penn might not have been much of a dancer, but there was no denying her skill in other areas. Quietly, he placed the sketchbook back where he found it and left the room, closing the door gently behind him.